Hello, my dear friends. I'm gladly greeting you again. We are going on Periscope depth. And once again, Major Scott Ritter is my very welcome guest. Hello.
Hello.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing great, thanks. Yourself?
That's great. That's great to know. I'm fine, thank you. Well, a little bit overwhelmed with my duties as a deputy editor, so it comes with a job. So, sir, last time we met, it was more than a month ago. A lot of things have happened. I just wanted to ask you a brief overview what happened in Ukraine, which is worth mentioning, to your opinion.
I mean, it's a continuation of the same trends that existed a month ago, but they're reaching culmination. I mean, when we spoke last time, I made it clear that my assessment is that Ukraine is losing this conflict, and that Ukraine will lose this conflict, and their defeat will be decisive, and that it will be sometime this year. I continue to believe all of that. There's nothing that's happened to alter that analysis. In fact, what's happening only confirms the analysis. The battle for Bakhmut or Artyomsk, I can't. Am I pronouncing that incorrectly?
You're absolutely correct.
Okay, is coming to its tragic conclusion. And when I say tragic, I mean the loss of humanity on both sides has been considerable for Ukrainians. It has been backbreaking, according to both Ukraine and Russian sources. The level of casualties that have been incurred on the Ukrainians is beyond comprehension. Ukrainians, there's a lot of talk about a spring offensive, but one has to wonder, how do you turn rhetoric into reality? Where is this equipment going to come from? Where is the manpower going to come from? How do they plan on attacking Russian defenses that have been prepared in depth for months now? And how do they deal with the fact that the Russians continue to carry out comprehensive offensive operations throughout the length of the line of contact? The West is getting exhausted from this war. Again, rhetoric is one thing, reality is another. The quantity and quality of equipment is starting to diminish, along with the political willingness to continue to underwrite this war, this very expensive war. There's a lot of pressure being put on Ukraine by the West to accept a negotiated settlement. Russia has made it clear they have specific objectives that have to be fulfilled, and that they're not going to negotiate those away, that any negotiation would have to meet all Russian objectives. So whether the two can come together, we'll see. I think that there's still a lot of fighting left. There's going to be some very violent fighting, bloody fighting. Both sides are going to suffer casualties, but Russia is on track to achieve the strategic defeat of the Ukrainian military by the end of summer, early fall of this year. The political aspects of this conflict, politics are always more complicated. And how Russia achieves denazification hasn't been articulated by Russia itself. So we don't know what their plan is. I've spoken to some people who talk about, sort of military law for a period of time, re-education, tribunals, arrests, imprisonment. And again, that's rhetoric. Turning that rhetoric into reality is always a challenge. So I think Russia has an easier task defeating the Ukrainian military, and a more difficult task coming up with a way to bring conflict termination, and yet on terms that are acceptable to Russia, but also acceptable to the West. I mean, Russia at some point in time will have to make a decision how they want this war to end. And understanding that if their conditions are too stark, then the West won't concede, and the war could continue with tragic consequences. Again, every death is a tragedy. So we'll see what happens with the politics. But this is this is still a conflict that Russia has all the advantages. There's no disadvantages for Russia right now.
Yeah, a couple of days ago, I did have a live stream where my viewers were asking questions, and I was answering them. There was a question about Odessa, and I figured that the best way for Odessa would be sucking off the military of the city, so pulling it off to someplace another where they need it. So Odessa would be way more empty city. I mean the military, Ukrainian military. And that would, in some point, be easier not to turn Odessa into Mariupol when it comes to storming the city. Or maybe the storming would not be necessary. What do you think about it?
One of the problems with war is that the enemy always gets a vote. So it doesn't matter what you want. It matters what the enemy wants as well. And it's my belief that Russia cherishes Odessa. It is a city of historic importance. It's not just a city of contemporary value, but one of historic cultural importance. And Russia would be loath to see it put to the sword, so to speak. I don't believe Russia wants a repeat of Mariupol anywhere, but especially in a city like Odessa. But it's not just Russia's choice. Russia will do what it has to do to achieve its stated objectives. But this is why I've always believed that when Vladimir Putin answered the question from the Hungarian journalist last summer, that answer was extraordinarily important. I'm somebody who actually listens to what the Russian president says and respects the fact that he's a man who isn't trivial. When he says things, there's thought behind it, and that we should respect his words. So when he indicated that Odessa could be the key to military victory or the key to peace, I take him very seriously. And so I know there's a lot of Russian people. I always, emotions run high. And I always speak about the potential of a peace settlement that leaves Odessa in Ukrainian hands. And they say, never, never, never. Well, they're not the Russian president. They don't have the weight of tens of thousands of lives on their shoulders. They don't have the future of their country on their shoulders. They don't have to live with the consequences of destroying a city of the cultural and historic value of Odessa. Vladimir Putin does. And I also think that he thinks strategically, meaning that while there may be animosity and rancor today between Russia and Ukraine, at some point in time, the Russian vision must be to peacefully coexist with Ukraine as neighbors, not as enemies. And as such, if there is a way to terminate this conflict, demilitarize Odessa, have it an open city under Ukrainian sovereign control, but one that respects its Russian heritage and is tolerant of a Russian population and Russian language and religion, etc., where Russians can freely travel to and fro, that's not a bad outcome. That's not a bad outcome compared to the alternative, which would be to assault the city, raise the city, destroy the city. You know, in Vietnam, there was a saying, we had to destroy the village to save the village. And if you reflect on that, that's about as dumb as it can get. So if the concept is you have to destroy Odessa to save Odessa, you might want to rethink your approach. But again, both sides have a vote on this. I have said all along that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government have been the adults in the room. That while the children scream and gnash and tear things apart, the adults stand back and think, beyond the chaos, but how do we get them to lunch? How do we get them to take a nap? How do we get them through the day? And I believe that that's the role the Russian government's playing right now. It's frustrating for people who will allow their emotions to be overtaken by the tragedy of this war. I'm not being critical of those people. You're talking to somebody who can get very emotional himself about issues. I know what anger is. I know what frustration is. But I also know that if you sleep on an issue, when you wake up in the morning, oftentimes you have a wiser approach to separate yourself from the emotion and think about the practicalities. And that's Vladimir Putin's job. His job is to sleep on the issue, separate himself from the emotion, and think about the practicalities. So I personally believe that the Russian government, and again, I listened to his speech on February 21st. There was no talk about taking Odessa. There was no talk about taking Dnipropetrovsk. There was no talk about taking Kharkov. Those are three cities with significant Russian populations. That easily, if there was a referendum, you could achieve the votes necessary to justify annexation. But he's not talking about that, because the Russian goal has never been to annex Ukrainian territory. Russia was compelled to do so because of Ukrainian actions, and because of the will of the people residing in those territories. But if this war can come to an end, I would hasten to bet that if you went and interviewed an ethnic Russian in Odessa and gave them a choice of, if your choice is live under the heel of a Nazified Ukrainian government or have the Russian army come in and liberate you regardless of the consequence, I believe many would have the Russian army come in and liberate us, whatever the consequence. But that the goal is to live in a peaceful Odessa, free of oppression, paying taxes to a Ukrainian government that is tolerant of your religion, your ethnicity, your language, and being able to freely interact with Russia so that you don't lose that connectivity, all the while living in a city that has been untouched by war. I think people would take that. That's not a bad option, especially if you say you get to have your children, they're alive, your parents are alive, your friends are alive, your colleagues are alive. There are many people in Mariupol and Bakhmut. I apologize for fumbling that word, and elsewhere who can't say the same thing. They can't say their children are alive. They can't say their parents are alive. They can't say their friends are alive, their colleagues are alive, because they died in the battle for those cities. And if you ask them, was it worth it? That'd be a tough question to answer. What is the price you give for your children? What is the price for your parents? What is the price for your friends, for your family? And so I think that's the thought process right now regarding Odessa. But again, I don't know. This is just analysis. I don't have my red phone that I can pick up, push the button, and talk to the Russian president. So this is speculation made by an American thousands of miles removed from the problem. Vladimir Putin's statement was made in the summer of 2022. A lot has happened since then. And there are more factors that must be considered by him and the rest of the Russian government. So perhaps their thinking has changed, but nothing can change the fact that you don't want to be in a situation where in order to save Odessa, you have to destroy Odessa.
Yeah. By all means, Vladimir Putin is one of the most sober-minded leaders which I know. And right now you just touched the nerve, because I feel the most lucky guy. Because my father, my aunt, my cousin, my father's wife, and some friends, they all survived the battle for Mariupol. They all came out, made it out alive. So I can't just even say anything about the choice our president does have, because all of my dear ones are alive, and lucky me, and that's why my mouth is shut on this question. I cannot just sitting over here where no bullet flying over me, saying whether I want this or that. That's not a choice for me to make. Yeah, and I'm saying this mostly for those of you, my dear friends, who thinks it's an easy job to be a president. Nothing like that. It's not an easy job even for Joe Biden, by the way, no matter how we don't like him.
One of the things we do in the United States is we always take a photograph of a president's face on the day of inauguration, and how fresh it is, how youthful the face looks. And then take a photograph of that face even 4 years later, how tired the face is, how worn out the face is. The job of leading a major world power is it's life altering. And then if they do that for 8 years, they look even more worn out. Again, regardless if you like their politics or you don't like their politics, it doesn't matter. The job is difficult. What I can say, though, if you take a look at Vladimir Putin's face, it's aged, but that's because he's been in office for 23, 24 years.
Yeah. We
all age after 24 years, but there's still a radiance there. There's still a vibrance that tells me that, he, for a man who was the most unlikely president Russia's ever had, a man who didn't seek the office. The office was thrust upon him. He didn't want it. He has grown into this job. I don't want to sound too much like a sycophant, because I understand that there's no such thing as the perfect person. But that's okay. We're humans. That's what we are, imperfect. That's what makes us wonderful.
Absolutely.
If I were a Russian and I were religious, I would wake up every morning and give a prayer of thanks that God delivered to my nation this man at this time. Because if you go back and study, and I've spent a lot of time reading up on it, the succession from Yeltsin, what was going on around Boris Yeltsin at the time, the pack of wolves that were surrounding him, waiting to eat Russia up when Yeltsin stepped aside. Anybody but Putin, your country would have been destroyed. Anybody but Putin, your country would have been destroyed. And I'll say that one more time. Anybody but Putin, your country would have been destroyed. It was luck or divine intervention, but it happened. And look at Russia today. For all the people that are out there critical of Putin, and believe me, I mean, my God, of course we can criticize anybody. Nobody's perfect.
Absolutely.
Russia's a huge country. The complexity of governing Russia, I don't know if even Russians reflect on it sometimes. The span that you're talking about. How many time zones are you guys? 11 time zones, 14? I don't know, but it's a lot of time zones. It's a big country.
Yeah.
And so just communication alone is complicated. In America, I have to wait 3 hours to call Los Angeles. In Russia, you got to wait 12 hours to call Vladivostok. I mean, it's just the time difference is crazy. Yeah. So, and I might be wrong on that. I know people are going to come on. No, Scott, it's only 8 hours. Okay, I'm making a point, not trying to be specific here, but and the fact that Russia has been led through, and again, most of us, when we want to start a job, you want to start in a building that's intact, the basement, the foundation is solid, the phones work, you have connectivity, you have a staff, and all that stuff. But if someone said, hey, we're going to hire you to a job, and you show up and the building's been burned down, the basement's flooded, there's no communication, no electricity, you don't have a desk, you don't have anything, and you have to start right now to fix it because you got a war going on in Chechnya that the CIA is trying to use to tear your country apart, that would be a nightmare. That's the state of Russia that Vladimir Putin inherited. A nation in total disarray, totally dysfunctional, corruption beyond imagination. And he has taken you to where you are today. Is it perfect? No. Is there still corruption? Yes. He'll even admit that. How do you go from being what was in Yeltsin Russia in the 1990s, this decrepit, swamp-infested, sewer-ridden country? And I'm not saying that that's Russia. I'm saying that's what Boris Yeltsin did to Russia. To where you are today, where hopefully in a little bit I'll get to see it firsthand, but from what I see from a distance is a modern nation with good infrastructure, with good services, where when you go to the government does what it's supposed to do without you having to put bribes under the table. You know, the law, you can, there's predictability in the courts, meaning that there is a law that the courts adhere to. You know where you stand, what the left and right limits are. To me, the transformation is just beyond imagination. Maybe for Russians who experienced it one day at a time, you don't see you know, that because it's been gradual. So you've just gradually grown to accept this gradually improving situation as the norm. And if that's the case, then the complaints that you had in the 1990s continue to follow you through. But if you could make a time jump from then to now, knowing full well what then was, and then compare and contrast it to the now, there would be no complaints. None. And this is the sole responsibility of Vladimir Putin. He's not a dictator, but he's one hell of a leader. And Russia's been blessed by him. And frankly speaking, the world has been blessed by him, because if we had a lesser man in a position of power in Russia, subjected to the pressures that he's been put on by nations that hate Russia, hate him, we might not be here today, because a lesser man might have taken some of the stuff personally and responded in a way that led to a conflict. So someday I hope the world will look back once history can be written, the facts are known, and analysis can be made free of the pressures of the immediate moment, and say, well, I'll give you an example. We have a president, Jimmy Carter. And I have to tell you, when Jimmy Carter was the president of the United States, I did not like Jimmy Carter. Not at all. I didn't know him as a person, just as a leader. I'm like, no. But when you, over time, the first thing comes out is what a good man he is. What a good man he is. That still doesn't mean he's a good leader, but what a good man he is. And the importance about knowing that he's a good man means that when you go back and you evaluate the decisions he made as president, you have to understand that it came from a place of purity, that he wasn't a bad person trying to use the office of the presidency for personal gain. He was a good man trying to make the right decision for the benefit of the country. And you also have to understand that he inherited a mess, a horrible mess. Not quite as bad as what Boris Yeltsin did to Russia, but come on, Richard Nixon what Richard Nixon did to American politics because of Watergate, the state that the Americans were in, the Arab-Israeli conflict, the oil embargo, what did to our economy, the state of race relations, post-Vietnam malaise. If you look at all the issues that were piled up on Jimmy Carter's desk when he assumed office, they would compete with many of the issues that were piled up on Vladimir Putin's desk, including issues about how we deal with other nations. Jimmy Carter had to deal with, Iranian fanatics seizing American diplomats and holding them hostage. He had to deal with, Russia and Afghanistan. Now, we know that that was his fault because of Brzezinski encouraging him. But again, I don't believe that Carter did this because he hated Russia. I think he did it because he was dealing with an America that was weak and a Russia that looked like it was strong. And so how do you weaken Russia? And Brzezinski said Afghanistan. So, it is what it is, the decisions he made. But you go back and you re-examine the Jimmy Carter era, from a defense standpoint, many of the things we give Ronald Reagan credit for, the B-1 bomber, the MX missile, things of that nature, Jimmy Carter did. But he doesn't get any credit for it. He stabilized America after the Nixon debacle. He doesn't get any credit for it. Things that we say Ronald Reagan did, Jimmy Carter did, but because he wasn't a braggart, because he didn't go out there and brag, and because he was hampered by the debacle of Iran, the Iran rescue mission, 8 bodies in the desert. But my point is, when you look at Jimmy Carter today, I think if somebody was writing a history of Jimmy Carter's presidency within 4 years after his presidency and was writing one today, it'd be totally different histories, totally different histories. And so today we have a lot of Americans who are doing instant biographies of Vladimir Putin. And they're full of prejudice, they're full of rancor, they're full of ignorance. But in 20 years, if an objective historian can sit down with access to all the information, I will bet you that they will write a book that says that Vladimir Putin is one of the most significant historic figures of this century, that he is literally the man of the century. Because there's nobody else that can compete with him in terms of their impact on not only Russia, but the world. Vladimir Putin is a force of stability in the world. We'll never give him credit here in the West. We contend we ignore the role that we play in global instability. But Putin was dealt a very weak hand, played it strong. I'm giving some poker analogies here. I don't know if Russians play poker.
I do.
Threw some cards in and got some good cards, and now he has a very strong hand. He's in a good position. If I were a Russian, I would say a silent prayer of thanks that whatever divine being or circumstance you believe in, you were graced with a leader of his stature and his capability.
Yeah. Scott, I don't know anybody who would put it in such strong words, emotionally strong words, even when you're telling it comparative, not emotional. But I always knew why Russian viewers love you so much, because of, one of my most favorite movies about school days, filmed way in 1968. There was a phrase: the happiness is when you are understood by someone or by people. And that's why people love you. You understand Russians. You understand other people. You understand, not necessarily Russians. You just understand people. And that's a reflection.
I try to understand.
Well, and you are very good at it.
Well, I'm trying. I make an effort. It's an honest effort, but I'm not arrogant enough to believe that I have solved the Russian puzzle. I just like I'm not arrogant enough to believe that I've solved the American puzzle. The beauty of humanity is the complexity of humanity, and the joy of life is the thrill of discovery throughout the journey. So I appreciate your kind words, but you should know that I don't believe I understand Russia yet, and I have a lot to learn. And that's why I am very much looking forward to travel to Russia, to meet Russians, to see parts of Russia that I've never seen, to experience it, to continue this journey of discovery so that I might better understand Russia. But I always have problems with somebody who says, well, I've learned everything there is to know. I'm like, well, then you're dead. Because,
exactly.
If you're arrogant enough to believe that you've learned everything there is to know, then we have no need to have a further discussion, because to me, a discussion is, again, part of that journey of discovery. A discussion is a process that leads to new knowledge being absorbed. And once you absorb new knowledge, you reevaluate things and you come up with new ideas, and then you start the process all over again. It's about growth. So I appreciate it, but I think any Russian who meets me and talks to me, if they're honest, they're going to walk back and go, he doesn't know as much as we thought he knew, because I don't pretend to. I'm trying to learn, but just because I've read Tolstoy doesn't mean that I'm an expert on Tolstoy. It means I read Tolstoy.
Absolutely,
Tolstoy,
yeah.
I'm studying Tolstoy. But
your willingness to understand people.
That's
That's what is of most value for us and for other people. Well, when someone says, I know everything and I absorbed all the knowledge of the world, which not even Obi-Wan Kenobi or Yoda would say, unless they are there, it means, yes, the person knows maybe very little about himself. So, yes, that's what I meant. That's what I meant, your willingness to understand. And this is what life is about.
Yeah.
If you are willing to understand people, so you are most likely to do the right thing. And like, well, Colonel Frank Slade in one of my most favorite movies, Send a Woman with Al Pacino, said, when I came to Crossroads, I knew exactly what the right path was, but I didn't take it because it was too damn hard. So, and if a person tries to understand, the person most likely to take the hardest step. So, and I really hope that I will do my best, well, to try being such person, because it's very hard.
It's very hard.
It's very damn hard.
We always take a look at that and go, the easy path.
Yeah.
The easy one.
The easy path.
I like that path. It's better. It's easier. But the thing about the easy path is when you finish, it's unfulfilling. When you take that hard path,
yeah,
and you sacrifice and you struggle and you work, when you get to the end, you say, I earned this.
Yeah.
I earned this, and I accomplished
Absolutely.
something, and I developed as a person. But at the moment when you get at crossroads, you're usually tired. You got your pack on, you're like, oh, I'm tired. That easy path's looking pretty good.
Yeah, and you come into the crossroads and say, oh, this again? Oh, gee.
How many crossroads will there be? Stop it with the crossroads already.
Yeah, many rivers to cross, but I don't seem to find my way over. Jimmy Cliff, a wonderful song.
Great song.
Really, really one of the best, in fact. Okay, here's a stuff which is making many people confused. Narishkin, you know exactly who the person is. Narishkin.
Yes.
Narishkin. Yes. Says that Poland seeks to occupy part of Ukraine and is willing to step in with its peacekeepers, double quote, in some part of Ukraine, but trying not to be in contact with Russian forces. So, and exactly I wrote it down. Well, and what do you think about this? About this? And you mentioned talking at Jeff's show that Polish attempt to enter Ukraine would be a suicidal mission, which wouldn't be covered by Article 4 or 5, and most likely none of NATO countries would do anything to protect Poland or Polish forces, which would be on Ukrainian territory from the fatal defeat. But anyway, why Naryshkin still thinks it's an issue?
Well, probably because he's the head of intelligence and he's receiving information that indicates it's still an issue. I mean, and let me also note that oftentimes in the intelligence business, and I don't pretend to speak on behalf of Mr. Naryshkin or the Russian intelligence services because they have their ways of doing things and it's there. But in my experience, when senior intelligence officials are speaking about something in public, it's not the most sensitive intelligence because they wouldn't be talking about it. And B, they're speaking because they want to achieve an outcome. They're putting information out there to do something, to achieve an outcome. An intelligence officer doesn't go before the public and release classified information just for the sake of releasing classified information. It's not his job to make you and I feel we're informed. If he's going to do this, it's because he's been directed by a higher authority, the president, to release information for the objective of trying to shape a situation on the ground. And so my guess is that there has been what we would call chatter in the West, phone calls of a nature that didn't require, for instance, again, this is just hypothetical, but let's say that the SVR, the Russian intelligence services, was able to come in and tap the phone of the Polish president, prime minister. You would never release intelligence derived from that source because that source is so sensitive you just don't want to give it up. So chatter is what happens when people far removed from the center of power are making phone calls that are easily intercepted, etc. That's chatter. So if you release something derived from that, it's very difficult to reverse engineer the statement back to the specific source, and it doesn't matter even if it did, because if person X23 stopped talking to person T32, it's not the end of the world. So my guess is it's this kind of information, chatter, that indicates that people are discussing something. And so by coming out and publicizing this, the idea is to get the senior Polish authorities to tamp down and say, no, we're not going. They want an outcome. And the outcome, I think, is to get the Polish government to say, we're not going to do this because the Russians are aware of it and we're not going to get away with this. And the practicalities of it, peacekeeping. In order for there to be peacekeeping, both sides have to want peace. They have to respect the status of peacekeeping forces. If one side, let's call it the Russians, doesn't respect the status of the peacekeeping forces, they're no longer keeping the peace, they're fighting a war. They're war fighters. So Poland can't come in and unilaterally, anoint a Polish armor division as a peacekeeping force. If they're not respected as such by the Russians, they are a Polish armor division that has invaded Ukraine. Now, there's another voice in here that has to be considered as well, and that is of President Lukashenko of Belarus. He has made it clear that he will not tolerate, that he views as an existential threat, any concept of Poland extending its contact with Belarus to the southern borders through western Ukraine to the south, that will not be an acceptable thing. And so the feeling I got from listening to him is that while he is not inclined to put Belarusian forces into Ukraine, he will support the Russian special military operation as he has done, but Belarusian forces won't cross into Ukraine, that this would change if Poland were to intervene. And then we have to understand that the Russians have said straight up, they won't, Polish troops coming into Western Ukraine as peacekeepers. There's an old saying that goes back to the Middle East, but when a camel is outside the tent and they stick their nose in, once the camel's nose is in the tent, it won't stop until the whole camel is in the tent. And so from the Russian perspective, a Polish peacekeeping force is the nose of the NATO camel. And if you allow that to stay there, NATO will end up in Ukraine. That's a 100% outcome.
That's what they were talking about Donbass back in 2014. What? Peacekeepers? Tell us about it. We know who those peacekeepers would turn into exactly.
Yeah. So I think that Narushkin is Mr. Narushkin. I don't mean to be disrespectful. Is not playing. Playing's the wrong word, but he's conducting a diplomatic game. And by game, I mean, it's a chess match. You're putting moving pieces. And so what he's done is he's taken, Queen's bishop to, King's, he's made a move. And now we'll see how Poland responds and how NATO responds. Because remember, the move is being made not just for a Polish audience, but for a NATO audience, because NATO is going to sit there and go, Poland, if you go in there, if we haven't convened an Article 4 hearing where we've given you NATO blessing, you're going in naked. And if you get attacked, we can't come to your assistance because we're not going to go to war with Russia over Ukraine. There's a wild card in here too. Zelensky went to Poland, I believe, recently, and there was talk about somehow erasing the border between Ukraine and Poland. And
you're coming to the question I wanted to ask you right away. So please go on.
I'll let you ask the question.
No. This is exactly the question about this talk of Zelensky Duda, that the confederation of Ukraine, or what left of Ukraine after special operation has ended, is sooner or later, or in some foreseeable future, is absolutely real. And you were starting to answer that question. I'm really sorry I interrupted you.
No, that's okay. The problem with that thinking, let's talk about international law. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm sure in your audience there's people who are international lawyers who are going, this will be interesting. That's what Major has to say about international law. Yeah. But so forgive me if I get it wrong. But my understanding is example Article 5 protection under the treaty, the NATO Charter. An attack against one is an attack against all. One of the reasons why NATO doesn't allow nations that are in conflict to join NATO is that by doing so, they inherit that conflict. Therefore, NATO will automatically find itself at war. So they've drawn a red line that says you must have all of your issues resolved before you join, so you join with a clean slate. So Ukraine is a nation in conflict. And Poland has to understand that the stability and peaceful status enjoyed by Poland does not transfer to Ukraine if such a confederation is made during war, but rather the conflict of Ukraine transfers to Poland. And that's an absolute. If Poland and Ukraine were to create this union, first of all, it redefines Poland's status. And there are many in NATO who would say Article 5 no longer applies because Poland has done something unilaterally without the permission of NATO, without the concurrence of NATO. NATO is a consensus-driven organization. So therefore, well, Poland will inherit the conflict. That's the point I'm trying to make. Ukraine doesn't inherit the peace. Poland inherits the conflict. And NATO needs to weigh in. So I think that's why Mr. Narushkin is talking about this, because he's trying to remind everybody, all parties involved, that this is not going to go the way Poland and Ukraine think it's going to go. Just because the Polish president and the Ukrainian president have sat down and done something on the maps, it doesn't change the basic principles of international law, which is Poland is a nation in conflict. That conflict will transfer to any nation that seeks to attach itself to Poland politically or militarily. This is why nobody in NATO wants to be called a direct party to the conflict, because that automatically, even though they are direct parties to the conflict, they don't want to be labeled as such, because that changes the scope and scale of the conflict. So I think that's what Narushkin is doing, is trying to put a marker on the table that we know what you're doing, we know what you're talking about, and the consequences of that would be dire.
And as far as I understand their talk, the key phrase was, after the special military operation is over, Ukraine and Poland will be confederated. And this is a theater absurd, because leftovers with Poland. So we are talking about the Belarus, which doesn't want it. Again, another conflict, another collision? No. Or you mean that you will recapture all the territories up to the border before February 2022? So this is an absurd too. So I don't know, maybe they are playing some strange play, staging some things to, I don't know for whom, for Ukrainian, maybe for Ukrainian population, maybe for Europe to say we are fine, we are on track of winning and so on and so forth. But this is an absurd. And
I'll just throw one thing out there, though, that could complicate this more, because what's good for the goose is good for the gander. I don't know if the Russians have that phrase, but
say that again.
What's good for the goose is good for the gander, meaning if you can do it, I get to do it as well. Mm-hmm. And I think one could make the case that in Western Ukraine, the majority of the population, if given the choice of self-determination, might opt to break away from a post-conflict Ukraine and join with Poland. If there were a referendum held, there's a good chance that rather than live under Russian domination, they would opt to align with Poland. And this is going to be a tough one for Russia to navigate, because you can't hold a referendum in Crimea, you can't hold a referendum in Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk, and Lugansk, and then demand that the world respect this referendum, and then say, but no, Western Ukraine, you cannot have a referendum.
Yeah.
And if I were the Poles and I were the Western Ukrainians, that would be the direction I would be heading. I wouldn't be making any talk about peacekeepers. I wouldn't be talking about military force. I would confront Russia with the political problem of self-determination. Because now Russia has already initiated the process of breaking up Ukraine and absorbing territories through referendum based upon the principles of self-determination. So if the Ukrainians and the Poles went that direction, avoided the potential military conflict, and spoke purely of a this. This would lead to more difficulties too, because I think then in Transcarpathia you'd see the Hungarian element be absorbed by Hungary. You'd be seeing the dismantlement of Ukraine, which is the last thing post World War II Europe ever wanted. They wanted borders to be permanent, borders to be forever. You don't change them, because once you allow borders to be redrawn, you create the demon of territorial conquest that leads to. It's too late for the issue of borders being permanent. It is what it is, but Poland has to understand it's a double-edged sword, because I guess there's not a significant German population in Silesia anymore, but again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if Poland has greedy eyes towards Western Ukraine, there might be some Germans who have greedy eyes towards Prussia, Silesia, and the territories that were given to Poland at the end of the Second World War. So it's in Germany, maybe looking to Alsace-Lorraine and some French territories, and Italy might be examining the French Riviera, and the French Riviera might be examining the Italian Riviera, and everybody's going to be looking, and we're all back to square one again. So it's a very dangerous situation. The Poles would probably be well advised just to cease and desist, not to get into this game, this nationalist game, because it's not going to end well for anybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Let me ask you about Taiwanese leader Tsai Ing-wen visiting the United States and probably meeting with House Speaker McCarthy, which made quite a wake within Chinese politicians, who condemned this visit and the way she was treated in the United States. They said that they are staging some sort of escalation, and they are reiterating the relations between China and the United States. So she talks about military assistance again. And since we spoke last time about Taiwan, does it shatter your belief that there won't be military conflict between China and the United States, or let's say some sort of war for Taiwan? Can this visit be fatal to the belief that there won't be any conflict?
I think to answer that question, we first have to talk about what is the nature of the Chinese leadership. Are they impulsive, or are they deliberate? Is their solution to go for the gun, or to go for the pen, meaning diplomacy? And when just those two questions alone tells you a lot. They're very deliberate, and they choose the pen over the sword. So the idea that China would allow itself to be provoked into a war they don't want, it's not their objective, and understanding that the Taiwanese president is up for election in November of 2024, and that she performed horribly in the last midterm elections, and that the Kuomintang party, the party of opposition, which won the last election, is in an active process of working with the Chinese to avoid conflict, to talk about how they can peacefully reach an outcome that's to their mutual benefit. So the deliberate Chinese who prefer peace over war, I believe, are going to let this thing ride out, as long as the United States and the current Taiwanese government don't do anything that's precipitous in nature. It's one thing to talk about military assistance. Understand the United States has been providing military assistance to Taiwan for decades now. It's a cornerstone of our one China policy, is to enable Taiwan to defend itself from aggression. And there could be some escalation in terms of the quantity and quality of weapons that are provided to the Taiwanese. But from the Chinese perspective, first of all, most of those programs would not have reached fruition by the time the November 2024 election rolls along. So it's in their best interest to seek a peaceful outcome and to create conditions that facilitate the defeat of the incumbent and her replacement with a Kuomintang party that's willing to work with China so that Taiwan doesn't wake up one morning looking like Bakhmut. And I think that many Taiwanese are looking at the Ukrainian conflict saying, there before the grace of God go us. That if there is a war, that's our future and we don't want that future. There also should be looking at how the United States is treating Ukraine. I mean, it's amazing if you do the parallels. John McCain visiting Kiev, Lindsey Graham visiting Kiev, Joe Biden visiting Kiev, saying great things about friendship and all that. And yet at the end of the day, bam, they're going to be gone and Ukraine's going to be left dead. So all this talk and bringing in and, whining and dining the Chinese leader, the Taiwanese leadership and words about assistance. I hope Taiwan understands how empty those are, that when push comes to shove, the United States is not a good friend. We're the worst enemy. And I don't mean enemy in terms of saying we're an enemy. I'm saying we pretend to be your friend, but we will betray you every single time. And that's the future of Taiwan. The United States will not commit suicide for Taiwan. Ukraine has far more strategic value to the United States than Taiwan does. And look what we're doing to Ukraine. So we would abandon Taiwan that quick. We would have Taiwan destroyed, not because, and the reason we would do it is not because we're defending Taiwan, but we're doing it for the same reason why we're destroying Ukraine. To bring harm to Russia, we would seek to bring harm to China. But as the case with Russia, which, understood what was going on, adapted to these circumstances, and flipped the script so that the harm is actually being done to everybody but Russia. China, I believe, likewise has positioned itself so that if the United States were to try and do the Ukrainian play in Taiwan, that the United States and whatever allies it was able to assemble would pay the price, that China would emerge stronger, more unified, victorious. Taiwan, on the other hand, would be destroyed, and that would be tragic. So China doesn't want that outcome. China is doing whatever is necessary to achieve a peaceful resolution to this issue. And while they are, yes, concerned about, Kevin McCarthy's meeting with the Taiwanese president, I don't believe they're going to allow that to trigger a conflict, because they just don't want a conflict. And frankly speaking, they don't need it, because if they just wait until November 2024, there's a good chance they're going to have a new political leadership in Taiwan, and that will change the trajectory of Taiwanese-Chinese relationships.
And China, by the way, is the country which formerly brokered the peace between two enemies, Saudis and Iran. They just signed the documents on Chinese soil, shaking hands. And who brokered this? China, which is a huge player on this. And to my understanding, if China managed to do this, and by the way, looking to what you said, without strong Russia and strong Russian leader, this signing would not be possible. Doesn't matter who brokered it. But anyways, China is just overwhelmed, even me, by what it's done. Jesus, this is huge and this is great. So, as far as you are American patriot, and I hugely respect that. America is a great country, is a country of great culture. I do love American culture, American music, American theater, cinema, a lot of good things which Americans created. But this is what America is losing. And I think American politicians should wake up and do something. Maybe they just have to turn the steering wheel and go other direction to goodwill. And that's what you are going to do with your tour and what you are doing, which is a huge thing to do by you. And please allow me ask you another question about Ukraine. They there are news that Ukraine scraped another 40,000 stormtroopers, like they say, stormtroopers, young people, old ones, even women, and they are willing to start some sort of offensive. But there is an opinion that, and this opinion was published at the American Conservative by a American journalist, and the opinion is that Finland, which is basically a NATO country now, is encouraging Zelensky to do some stupid move, like storming Crimea, like turning those troops to Crimea. I can't imagine how that is possible when you having such a mess in Artomovsk at the east of Ukraine. I don't know, but they are absolutely serious. And some officials in the United States, it was written in Russian news outlet, and maybe they are mistaken, is like we are warning that Ukraine may come to the border of Crimea and start an offensive. What is this all about? Is that serious or what?
Well, first of all, you have to understand that from a principled standpoint, Ukraine has never accepted the Russian acquisition of either Crimea or the Donbass or Kherson, Zaporizhia. And its Western allies, the United States and Europe, likewise don't recognize that. So from a legal debating point of view, when Ukraine says we want to, take Crimea, they're saying we want to take our land back. We want to take our land back.
Yeah.
All right, and that from a political standpoint, I understand why they would say that. They have to say it. They have no choice but to say it, make that talk. Except that at some point in time, you have to understand that if you want to translate rhetoric into reality, what the consequences of that reality is. Let's say hypothetically that Ukraine could assemble sufficient force necessary to break through Russian defenses and make a successful drive on Crimea. What does that mean? That's the equivalent of the United States enabling Mexico to break through the Rio Grande and drive on Austin, Texas, to reacquire Texas as part of Mexico before taking a western hook through New Mexico, Arizona, and into California to bring it all back to Mexico.
Rio Grande, I'm sorry, Scott, Rio Grande, I'm missing
it's a river. It's a river that separates Mexico from Texas. And so my point is, Americans would say, you can't do that. That's an existential threat to America. And we're going to kill you if you do that. And if you're almost accomplish it, we will use nuclear weapons because that would be the death of America. Nuclear weapons exist to ensure America doesn't die. Therefore, if you're killing America, we will kill you. End of story. So here we have Russia, nuclear power, that said that one of the triggers for the release of nuclear weapons would be if there's a accumulation of conventional non-nuclear military capability that presents a existential threat to Russia. So anybody who says we encourage Ukraine to launch an attack that threatens Crimea is saying we encourage Russia to use nuclear weapons against NATO. And I believe that most responsible leadership understands this. If the Finnish leadership is saying this, then they're not responsible leadership, and they are condemned by their own words. But now let's just come down to brass tacks. Is that a statement the Russians understand? If I say brass tacks, it means serious. We're going to talk about the serious issues right now. Offensive combined arms operations are some of the most complex military maneuvers that are done by any modern force. It's like a ballet to get tanks, working with infantry fighting vehicles, working with artillery, working with drones, working with aircraft, working with satellites, reconnaissance, getting it all to come in into one where everything's moving in harmony towards a common objective. If you break all that down into its component pieces, the amount of training required in terms of getting the component pieces up to a skill level of just on their own, how to operate a tank, how to maneuver a tank, how to maneuver a tank platoon, how a tank platoon maneuvers with a tank, and as part of a company or battalion. And then how do they do all that working with infantry? So you don't run the infantry over, so you don't outpace your infantry, so the infantry is screening you properly. And then to do that by bringing in artillery that is suppressing enemy positions while providing counter battery fires. Then you bring in drones that are gathering information for targeting purposes, for maneuvering and carrying out electronic warfare operations, etc. The training for all those components is prohibitively long. I know. I used to do it for a living. It takes to just train a basic Marine straight out of boot camp, 13 weeks. And all you've done there is teach them how to get a haircut, wear a uniform, march, and perform some basic functions. Then you have to send him off or her off to advanced individual training, to their specific MOS. And depending on that, that could be weeks, months, depending on the complexity of that. But even then, that's just a skill set. Then that Marine has to be incorporated into an existing unit that already has experienced Marines. You don't create these units from scratch. You don't bring all these inexperienced people together and say, now you're going to be expected to do this. They join a unit that has already been in existence and training. So the people there, the majority of them have 3, 4, 5, 10, 15 years experience doing this. They are experts in their field. And these untrained people, these newly trained people, inexperienced people, join this, and then they are learned. Before a Marine unit goes to combat, they receive their Marines. Then they will spend 6 months training that unit to get up to certain tasks where the junior Marines begin to learn to work as part of this team. And then they can go off and do their mission.
Otherwise, those fresh units are just nothing but cannon fodder.
They can't function. They don't know how to function.
I know exactly what you're talking about, because I used to be trained as an officer long ago.
Well,
I'm no officer now, but I remember.
Well, you know how they think.
Yeah.
The point is, the Ukrainian military has been decimated by this war. So the idea that they have units that are similar to a Marine unit with experienced people, veterans who are working, is not. They've all been killed. These units are being thrown together with very small cadres of experienced people, mainly inexperienced people, who are taking shortcuts to training. Do you think they have 13 weeks to do basic training for a Ukrainian soldier? And then after that, do they have 3 months to give them more advanced individual training, and then 6 months to train them up as part of a unit? No, they're being thrown in with days, sometimes, at best weeks of training to be expected to be able to perform in combat. You can't perform in combat like that. You die. You tend to get killed. And this is what happened. The Ukrainian military is putting together these units that lack the skill set necessary to function and survive on the modern battlefield. Now, it's one thing to do this on the defense. Okay, dig a hole, stay in the hole, and at the appropriate time, jump up, and either you take one in the head or you fire off this weapon, and maybe it works and you kill some Russians, and then you come down and you do it again. You're dead. That's okay. You killed a couple Russians. We're happy. We'll replace your body with somebody new, and we'll repeat all over again. I mean, that's just meat grinder operations. But now you want to say, get up and maneuver. Get up and suppress the enemy. Get up and do an assault on a fortified position. Get up and do anything. You can't get up if you don't have the training. You'll get slaughtered. And this is the reality. Ukraine simply doesn't have the forces necessary to carry out large-scale, meaningful offensive operations against the Russians. Now, people say, well, Scott, what about September? Well, understand September was different. The shock troops in the Ukrainian military were almost exclusively mercenary forces from Western militaries who had experience, who were organized to do basic reconnaissance work. B, the Russians were overextended. They were defending a significant frontage with insufficient troops. You had special police battalions guarding frontages that should be, and when I say battalions, it's really a company, 120 guys guarding a frontage that should be protected by 600 members of a motorized rifle battalion. They didn't have artillery support. They had 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 kilometer gaps between their lines. So it doesn't take a highly trained force to penetrate that gap. And when you don't have a secondary line of defense or third line of defense, you can drive 20 kilometers without being stopped and get into the Russian rear. That's what happened in September. I mean, I'm not denigrating the Ukrainian forces. They functioned well. I'm saying that the Russians were insufficient to the task. Today, those Ukrainian forces don't exist. They've all been killed. They've been replaced by these rapidly mobilized people that are stiffened with some veterans, but now they're going up against a Russian defense that has created doctrinal first lines of defense, meaning sufficiently manned with sufficient firepower, sufficient resources to interdict an attacking force, break it up before it comes to the line. But B, even if they were able to succeed in punching through the first line of defense, there's a second line of defense that's fully manned that's going to greet them, slaughter them, and if they break through that, there's a third line of defense. And meanwhile, there's dedicated counterattack forces that will counterattack and destroy. Ukrainians don't stand a chance. They will not reach Crimea. I doubt they will penetrate the first line of defenses. In many cases, I doubt whether they'll even reach the first line of defenses because they'll be destroyed. But here's the other thing. With Bakhmut falling, with the number of casualties taking place, these people that they're trying to build up for this counteroffensive are going to be sent to plug the holes in the lines that are taking place. What counterattack force? This is why Zelensky is traveling to Poland to try and come up with a desperate outcome. Everybody, France right now is in China begging the Chinese to bring it into this conflict. Why? Because Ukrainians got nothing. There's nothing left. Nothing.
You mean Chinese to broker a peace or stop this conflict? Your thought was.
That's what Europe is desperate now for Chinese intervention that way, to broker a peace.
Emmanuel Macron visits China with Ursula von der Leyen. I can't say this name with straight face, I'm sorry. And they are talking about taking China away from Russia because they are planning to make China offer which cannot be refused, which cannot be dismissed. They want to make an ultimatum to China, economic ultimatum. So everybody thinks what China would choose, Russia, Iran, Saudis, or Europe and European markets. My guess, my wild guess is Europe is not going anywhere if China says, goodbye, guys.
No, you're 100% correct. I mean, China is not, again, impulsive. If I were the Chinese president, I wouldn't have let the plane land it. But no, China is diplomatic. All the doors are open. They'll talk to anybody. That's what they do. They'll receive the mission. They'll be polite. Europe will get a chance to make their statements and all this. And then the Chinese have a very, peculiar way of smiling at you and then asking you some very difficult questions, but they don't come across as difficult questions. But, things such as, yes, I understand you want peace. Tell us again about AUKUS and how that role it goes again. You speak of peace, and yet you're seeking to expand NATO into the Pacific. What is the role of NATO in the Pacific? Please explain to us. And Macron will be, with van der Leyen, and company. Yes, I understand you're upset with the Russians putting nuclear weapons in Belarus. Yes, it's a disturbing thing. I understand that. So, of course, you will commit to a principled stance of no foreign nuclear weapons on foreign soil at any time, right? So the B-61 bombs that are currently in NATO, you'll be demanding that they leave. Is this correct, right? And they'll, whoa. And China said, I think we should probably put a pause on this conversation because clearly you're not prepared to engage in the level that you indicated. But we appreciate you coming here. Here's a gift and have a safe flight home. I mean, that's what's happening in China right now. You know, think of the arrogance of these Europeans. Think of it for a second. All right? These are people who have, if you go back and look at the rhetoric that they've used about China over the years, they are not friends of China. They have said very bad things about China. And suddenly they want to come over and think because he's French or because she's, you know, German, that everything's going to be okay. It's
like
not.
this.
Two, do they not know what Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping have been doing for the last 20 years? You know, 10 years?
Looks like they don't. Looks like it.
You know, when was the last time Macron visited Xi Jinping for his birthday and they sat there and they made dumplings together and talked about that, you know, exchanged personal gifts. And I mean personal gifts, as friends give gifts, not as leaders give gifts, as friends. Does Macron think that because he's French, he can now come in and suddenly erase all of the history? Xi Jinping just spent 3 days in Moscow engaged in a high-level state visit, the first state visit. He didn't go to Paris. Xi Jinping didn't fly to Paris. He didn't fly to Brussels. He flew to Moscow, which tells you where the Chinese priority is. So this is wishful thinking. I think the best that France and Europe and the European Union could hope for out of this is to listen to the Chinese and take heed at what the Chinese are saying. This isn't about Europe dictating anything to China. This is about Europe being put in its place by China and China dictating certain things to Europe about if you want the privilege of doing trade with China, because Europe, you do understand that all we have to do is hit the off switch and it's over for you. Click, done, lights out, goodbye. So stop flexing muscles you don't have. I mean, if you're going to go to the beach and take off your shirt, for God's sake, at least go to the gym for a couple of months beforehand so there's something to look at. But we don't want to see your pale, bloated body that's been hiding in the basement for the winter. I apologize for that visual. But
Major, you know, that's a knockout.
Pardon?
That's a knockout, Major. You just put them in knockout.
Well, I mean, but that's the truth. I mean,
absolutely yes, but it's a knockout.
But so anybody who thinks that Europe is going to leverage China away from Russia doesn't understand the importance of the February 4th, 2022 meeting, the significance of the 5,000-word joint statement made, you know, the ongoing diplomacy that's been taking place at every level between Russia and China. And again, Xi Jinping's, you know, 3-day visit to Moscow and the fact that, you know, Vladimir Putin will probably be visiting Beijing in the near future as well. This is a relationship that is strategic in nature, comprehensive, and they know who their enemies are. And their enemies are spelled, you can pronounce their enemies as Emmanuel Macron and Ms. von der Leyen. They are the enemies of China, and China knows this. But China is a mature nation. Again, we talked about this. They are deliberate. And they choose the pen over the sword, and they have a habit of just bringing you in, feeding you good food, shaking your hand, smiling. But at the end of the day, they will ask a series of questions for which you have no answer. And because you can't answer them, the meeting is over, nothing will be resolved, and you go on your way until you figure out how to responsibly interface with China. I can guarantee you Xi Jinping didn't ask any uncomfortable questions of Vladimir Putin. I can guarantee you that their conversation was constructive throughout. You can't say the same of what's going on right now between the French leader and the Chinese leader.
The judge, you know who I'm talking about, Judge Napolitano, is absolutely right. There's nobody like you, Major. There's nobody like you. Thank you so much for the conversation. It's always fascinating and in depth.
Thanks for having me.
Well.